Hello and welcome to this BA Creative Writing and Journalism webinar. I'm Maja Simunjak, I'm a program leader for this course and I'm also the senior lecturer in journalism, so I teach a range of journalism modules on the course. What I thought we'd do today is a little workshop on the topic of writers as detectives. So by the end of this workshop, I would hope that you would get a sense of how do writers of any sorts go about finding the people who have the information that they need in order to get their stories done, but also how do they make sense of what those sources tell them in the process of conversation. At the center of this discussion is what we call sources or information holders. In journalism, they're the cornerstone of the discipline or the profession. So what journalism does is we find stories that matter, we speak to people who are close to the story, so those who are initiating it or are affected by it or have meaningful opinions about it. And our job is to give a platform to these people to voice their experiences and opinions. Now, information holders and sources are important in creative writing as well, particularly if you're doing any kind of creative nonfiction, so, food writing, travel writing, memoirs, biographies. Obviously, you will want to find people who have information, good information about the story in order to make it more engaging, more interesting. But also, if you're doing, for example, fiction stories, you may want to kind of constantly be on the lookout for interesting information holder, interesting sources, in order to find inspiration for good characters or an interesting plot or an interesting dialogue. So let's get going. What we'll do first is we're gonna look at some of the, let's say, theory behind this concept. So who are the possible sources and information holders that you can turn to as a writer, but in particular as a journalist? So that's gonna be the lens that we will be looking through today. And then we're gonna do two exercises. Trying in a more practical way to see how can we perhaps think who might be a good source and how can we make sense of the possible things that these sources are saying. So let's get started. So first we're going to have a look at who are information holders. Now in journalism, we divide them on our diary contacts, but there are very often, we need to do detective work, well, let's call it detective work, in order to find the people who have the information for the story that we need. Let's look at the diary or the contacts first. So, these are the most common information holders that journalists are likely to already have in their diaries. Now, emergency services, I imagine that you can guess who these are. Yes, so for example, a fire brigade or a police. Now, often negative stories are negativity is a news value, so negative stories are newsworthy and journalists often write about them because they can have a big impact on people's lives. Another information holder that you're likely to already have in your diary are different kinds of institutions. So for example, Public Health England or National Union of Journalists or the government. So all of these institutions are information holders because they matter in the society, and you want to be able to get information from these institutions for your stories. Most of these institutions also have their spokespeople. So these are people whose job it is to facilitate this transfer of information from institutions to the public, but in particular to journalists. So actually spokespeople will be easy to find because they are those who want to speak to you in order to get their opinion, their point of view ahead. Now, what really makes a difference in between diaries of different journalists are their access to position holders. So let's say that the institution that has the information is the government. You're likely to have a contact with the spokesperson for the government. But if you also have a direct contact with, let's say, the Minister for Health or the Prime Minister, obviously that direct contact with the person who is actually making the decisions who has perhaps the most important opinion on the topic, or who has the most relevant information. That is what really makes a diary of a journalist really, really valuable. Now, as I said, on the other side, there are those kinds of contacts who you don't know before a story breaks. Now, let's see who they are and how you can do detective work in order to find out their names. So these kind of off-diary information holders are very, very often experts. So before this whole pandemic broke, I don't think that many journalists had an epidemiologist in their diaries. But once a story breaks, you want to find the person who knows most about the story or a topic. And here we often resort to experts. Now, these can be people who are working at a university, who are studying a topic, somebody with a lot of experience in a topic. And they can usually provide a very meaningful analysis or an overview, evaluation of what it is that is going on. Very, very important in these stories are also what we call, in quotation mark, victims. Now, I've put quotation marks here because they don't need to be victims in a traditional sense. You know, if there has been a mugging and the person who has been mugged, that person is a victim in that case. But victims, when we talk about information holders, they're more kind of anybody who has been negatively affected by whatever story it is that's breaking. So let's say the government is imposing a quarantine on any arrivals in the UK. Now, thinking about somebody who is negatively affected by this story, you can say, well, anybody who wanted to go on a holiday this summer, but they wouldn't now be able to because they wouldn't be able to spend 2 weeks at home afterwards, is potentially a victim of the story. And their views matter because whatever decision has been made obviously has a negative impact on somebody. And remember, negativity is a news value. Witnesses are great sources, but you have to be very careful with them. So having a witness to whatever has happened, their account of what happened, that really brings the story to life. However, you have to be careful with what they're saying, because often what a witness can tell you is their interpretation of the event. What you really need to be after, alongside witness accounts, are also facts. And finally, members of the public. You often see in any kind of news reports that members of the public are spoken to. So that can be anybody who is close to the story. It cannot be any member of the public. It has to be somebody who has a meaningful opinion or experience related to the story. Now, sometimes it actually is anyone. So if you have a story that there is a heat wave in England, then anybody in England would be a potential meaningful member of the public who can say, you know, how they feel, how the heat is affecting them, how they're dealing with it. That will be meaningful. However, let's say that, for example, a local theater group gave an unscheduled performance in a town square. Now, if that happened in Gloucester and you go to Reading and ask there what happened, members of the public will not have anything meaningful to say about it. So who you would want to speak to in that case would be people who actually witness, members of the public that witnessed that performance, or friends of the performance, or people who work in shops or restaurants around the town square to see how the performance has affected them. So members of the public are great to be used in stories, but you have to make sure that their contribution is meaningful. So these are kind of our main information holders. As I said, some of them you're going to have in your diary already, but very often you're going to actually have to sit down and say, okay, so this is my story. Who do I need to speak to in order to find out what happened and what do people think about it? So we have 2 exercises here to see how that can actually work in practice. First, let's have a look at this exercise. So this is what we call a role play. I want you to imagine that you are working for a hyperlocal site that is based in Soho. Now, a hyperlocal site, this is an industry jargon, it is a digital media site, it's always online, which is focused in its reporting on a very, very small and particular geographical area. Now, this hyperlocal site is based in Soho, so this is one of the most vibrant areas of central London. So you're working for a hyperlocal site that's focused on Soho, and you're given these two tips. So I want you to think about who you could speak to give some essence to the story, to make it more interesting, to make it more engaging, but also to be able to represent different points of view about the story. Let's do the first one together, and then if you want to, you can do the second one on your own. So, the first one says, famous travel writer published an unflattering story about Soho, saying it is overcrowded, overpriced, and tourists are better off avoiding it. So, this has happened. You're doing a follow-up on the story. Who could you speak to? Now, I've done this previously. Now I have some notes. So, who I would perhaps want to speak to write a follow-up on this story is a spokesperson for Soho or the London Tourist Board. So how are they responding to this criticism? I would also like to speak with tourists in Soho. You know, they're witnesses of what's going on. Do they agree with this evaluation? I would perhaps like to speak with a travel writer who has an opposite opinion, you know, somebody who has praised Soho. So do they agree with this? Or if not, why not? And I would probably also want to speak with the owners of bars or restaurants or theaters in Soho so they can give me their account. Like, do they think they're overpriced? If they do, why are they? Are they overcrowded? Do they feel like there are too many tourists around? Now, these are just a couple of different sources who can give me interesting information to write my story. Now, the second example says, pubs in Soho are protesting against a plan by the Soho Council to stop publishing their details in tourist information guides. The council claims that pubs have been giving false information about offers and standards. If you want to, you can pause here, have a little think, perhaps note down some of the information sources that you think might be interesting here, and then once you're done, hit play. Have you had a think? Well, I had, and these are some of my ideas for who to speak to for a story about the pubs in Soho. So I would obviously want to speak with pub owners because they're the ones who are accused of giving false information about offers and standards. Are they lying? Why? What do they think about the whole accusation? I would obviously also want to speak with the councillors from Soho because they are the one who are making the accusation. So I would like to hear, you know, why are they saying it? What kind of evidence do they have? If they had evidence before, why didn't they do anything before? Things like that. I would also like to speak with pubs customers and, you know, tourists in the area because they're basically the witnesses and potentially also victims if this information is correct. I might also want to speak with an expert on the topic. So in this case, perhaps it could be a lawyer who can tell me how this case can progress. So what are the legal rights of the pubs if the council doesn't allow them to continue publishing their details? You get the gist? Okay, good. Now we have another exercise here, and this one is focusing on what we call in journalism, why are you telling me this? Because one thing the journalists don't do is take information at face value. So whatever a source tells you, remember, they're often not facts. They're very often opinions, very often experiences, but sometimes it's not necessarily true. And it's our job to question what people are saying. So what we're doing here is we're trying to list all of the possible, sometimes hidden motivations that each of these sources might have for providing the indicated piece of information. So there are two of these here. We're going to do the first one together, and then if you want to, you can do the second one on your own. So example number 1 says that fast food chain spokesperson said that consumption of fried food 3 to 5 times a week is not one of the causes of obesity. Why this spokesperson might be telling us this? Well, maybe it's true, and we should be rethinking what we think about fried food. But maybe this spokesperson is kind of twisting some of the facts because they want to fend off some negative publicity. Or maybe they're just plainly lying because they want to raise their sales. Or maybe they're just simply misinformed. Maybe they really think this is happening, but if you question them further to provide evidence, it will actually show that it's not necessarily true. Now, let's try and do the second one. So the second one says, Foreign Secretary says, during last week's cabinet meeting, several ministers expressed concern over Prime Minister's ability to govern. So if you want to, click pause now, and once you're ready with possible explanations for why would the Foreign Secretary be saying this, then hit play. Ready? So I have given this a thought, and this is what I've been thinking. So obviously, it's possibly true. This could have happened, but maybe the Foreign Secretary is trying to cause trouble for the Prime Minister. Or maybe the Foreign Secretary is trying to decrease the Prime Minister's reputation. Maybe the Foreign Secretary is trying to see what kind of media reaction this would cause. Or maybe the Foreign Secretary is trying to decrease the faith, the trust of the public in the Prime Minister. So basically, maybe the Foreign Secretary is lying because he or she wants the Prime Minister's job. So here again, we're not taking the information at face value. We're taking the information, we're trying to think, why are you telling me this? And then obviously, in order to actually publish this story, you would want to speak with more people. You would try to confirm the information that was given, and you would try to find a balance, particularly if it's a controversial issue, on different opinions on the topic. So that was it for today in this webinar. So I hope that you have a better understanding of how writers act as detectives, who sources are, how we can go about finding them, and what do we do with the information they give us. Thank you.